Barlow Bend, Alabama, a place many wouldn't find on a map, but to the Ely family, it was everything. The red clay earth, the whistling pines, and the soft, rolling fields held more than just crops and wildflowers. They held memories, sweat, tears, and generations of legacy. It began in 1941 when Joe Ely, a determined black farmer, made a quiet yet extraordinary move. Through a U.S. Department of Agriculture program, he purchased a 127-acre tract of farmland for $2,500. In a time when racial barriers were ironclad and opportunities for black land ownership were rare, Joe's purchase was nothing short of revolutionary. He didn't buy it to boast. He bought it to build. He worked that land day in and day out, planting, harvesting, repairing, and protecting what he saw as more than property. It was promise. A promise to his children, a promise to their children, and to every Ely born after. When Joe died in 1959, he left no will. Like many of his generation, he trusted that his family would honor what he built. And for decades, they did. The land remained in the family, passed down piece by piece through the generations. Family cookouts filled the fields with laughter. Spiritual gatherings brought prayer and music under the stars. Cousins who'd never met before shared stories over fried catfish and watermelon during annual reunions. Every inch of the 127 acres breathed with the heartbeat of the Ely legacy. But as time passed, so did family members. With each death, their share of the land passed down without formal titles, fractured into smaller and smaller pieces among dozens of descendants. What had once been the single vision of one man now rested in the hands of many. And though they all loved the land, the system had quietly planted a vulnerability within their inheritance, one none of them could see coming. Michael Robinson, Joe Ely's grandson, had grown up running barefoot across that land, chasing fireflies and soaking in his grandfather's quiet pride. As he grew older, he felt the weight of that legacy. And when whispers began to circulate in 2012 that someone outside the family had gotten their hands on a piece of it, Michael felt a knot form in his chest. He didn't know the full story yet, but something was wrong. And deep in his gut, he knew the fight for their land hadn't ended with Joe Ely. It was just beginning. By the summer of 2012, the land in Barlow Bend still pulsed with family memories. Children laughed under the sun. Elderly uncles shared stories beneath the shade trees, and the scent of grilled ribs mixed with the thick Alabama air. To outsiders, it may have looked like just another patch of rural land, but to the Ely family, it was sacred, woven with the voices of their ancestors and the quiet pride of black ownership in a country where such things were hard won. That's why the envelope hit different. It was thin, just a few pages, but what it carried was heavier than any storm the family had weathered. A lawsuit, filed by a man named James E. Deschler II, a name none of them recognized. He wasn't family, not a cousin, not a neighbor, a total stranger, and yet the paperwork claimed he had rights to their land. Confused and alarmed, Michael Robinson, grandson of Joe Ely, read the documents again and again, trying to make sense of it. According to the lawsuit, Deschler had legally acquired a share of the property, just 1/15. Tiny on paper, but under Alabama law, that sliver was enough. It gave him the legal power to demand the sale of the entire 127-acre estate, every field, every tree, every memory. Michael's heart sank. This can't be real, he thought. But it was, and it wasn't a mistake. Deschler had purchased his fractional share from distant family, two relatives who hadn't been involved in reunions or community for years. Maxie Ely Jr. and Sharita Faye Ely had sold off their portion for reasons only they knew. Legally, they had the right. But morally, emotionally, it felt like a betrayal. Deschler wasn't buying the land to farm it. He wasn't moving in. He wanted it liquidated, sold off so he could pocket his share of the cash. And Alabama's partition laws backed him. Michael looked around at the land, still lush, still buzzing with life, and felt a fury rise in his chest. The Ely family wasn't just fighting to keep acreage. They were fighting to keep their story alive. But Deschler had money, attorneys, time. He was playing a long game. So Michael had to build his own army. He picked up the phone, called cousins, uncles, aunts, people he hadn't spoken to in years. One by one, he explained what was happening. Some were confused, others were skeptical. A few didn't want to get involved. But slowly, one by one, they came. Not because it was convenient, but because they knew what was at stake. The Ely Land Retention Committee was born, 40 relatives strong, united by blood and bound by history. They didn't have deep pockets. They didn't have legal degrees. What they had was purpose. And for the first time in decades, the fight for black land ownership wasn't just about what had been taken in the past, it was about what they still had a chance to save. The courtroom wasn't built for people like Michael Robinson. He wasn't a lawyer, he wasn't wealthy, he wasn't backed by investors or armed with loopholes. He was a grandson, standing between his family's legacy and a system designed to take it. The first time Michael stepped into that courthouse, he felt it. The weight, the formality, the chill of fluorescent lights on polished tile. On one side, James Deschler's attorneys, crisp in suits, armed with folders and confidence. On the other, Michael, representing generations of Ellys with little more than a binder full of notes, photos of family reunions, and a heart that refused to quit. Deschler's argument was simple, legally sound and brutally cold. He owned a 1/15th share of the property. That gave him the right to file for a partition by sale. In other words, sell the whole land, divide the cash, and walk away. The law didn't care that Deschler had never stepped foot on the land before. It didn't care about the cookouts, baptisms, or the ashes of loved ones scattered beneath oak trees. It cared about ownership, shares, and who could pay for process servers and attorneys. Michael was told the case could be over in weeks, but it wasn't, because the Ellis didn't run. They organized. The Land Retention Committee grew from a few cousins to over 40 family members. They held virtual meetings and Sunday calls, assigning tasks and sharing updates. Someone tracked down distant heirs. Another cousin coordinated church fundraisers. A retired uncle drafted letters to legal aid organizations. They scraped together what little they had, time, talent, and faith, and began building a defense. But nothing was easy. Each time a family member passed, their portion of the property splintered even further. That meant new heirs had to be located, identified, and notified by law. And every delay opened the door for Deschler to push harder. Time wasn't neutral. It was a weapon. And then came the worst blow. Money. The Illis weren't wealthy. Many of them worked hourly jobs, lived paycheck to paycheck. Deschler, on the other hand, had resources. Attorneys on retainer. Legal filings filed with speed. Michael remembers seeing a motion once, 4 pages, dense with jargon. It cost the family nothing to read, but it cost Deschler nothing to file. The imbalance was staggering. They applied for pro bono help. Sometimes it came, sometimes it didn't. One by one, attorneys took the case and then dropped it, citing complexity or conflicts. Michael kept a spreadsheet of every lawyer they approached. There were more names crossed out than circled. He started losing sleep. His wife noticed first, then his kids. "Dad, are we going to lose the land?" they asked. Michael didn't have an answer, but every morning he still got up, made calls, wrote emails, and kept pushing. Because giving up wasn't an option. This wasn't just about land. It was about dignity, about saying no to a system that had robbed too many black families for too long. And though they were fighting shadows with bare hands, something began to shift, quietly, slowly. People started to notice. For most families, 12 years is a lifetime. For the Ely family, it was the span of a legal war, a fight that dragged through seasons, through births and funerals, through reunions tainted by uncertainty. The land in Barlow Bend, once a sanctuary, had become a symbol of resistance, and every year that passed with the lawsuit unresolved was another year the family held its breath. Michael Robinson became the unofficial general of this war, but unlike a battlefield, the courtroom didn't reward courage with medals. It bled families dry with paperwork, court fees, and delays. The legal system moved at a glacial pace, made worse by the ever-changing cast of heirs. Every time a relative passed away, their share of the land split again, requiring courts to locate, verify, and notify new heirs. Some were in nearby towns, others scattered across the country. Each step slowed the process and fed Deschler's strategy. Wear them down, delay after delay, until they ran out of will. And still, the family held on. They met monthly over Zoom, organized fundraisers at churches and community centers, and collected donations in jars at local barber shops and beauty salons. A few local news stations picked up the story, and sympathetic attorneys offered limited help. But the core burden remained on the shoulders of the family, on Michael, who sometimes felt the weight of a century pressing on his chest. One day, Michael stood in the middle of the land and looked around. The trees swayed like they remembered the voices that had echoed through their branches. The field where he'd seen his uncles play horseshoes still smelled like smoke from long-gone barbecues. It was quiet now, too quiet. That day, he made a decision. The land wasn't going to save itself. The court might call it heirs' property, but to Michael, it was his grandfather's legacy. Fragmented, yes, but still intact in spirit. If Deschler could use the law to divide the family's strength, then Michael would use unity to make them whole again. He proposed something radical to the committee, creating a legal entity, a limited liability company, LLC, that would represent the family's collective interest. With everyone's agreement, the land could be legally protected, organized, and controlled under one name. No more fractional chaos. No more vulnerabilities. It wouldn't be easy, and not every family member would agree, but it was a path forward. The idea sparked hope. If they could survive Deschler's lawsuit long enough, this LLC could be their shield for generations to come. But time was not their ally. Court hearings loomed. Deschler wasn't backing down. And 12 years had already taken their toll. The land was still theirs. But for how much longer? There are battles that leave scars, and then there are those that carve into the soul. By the 5th year of the lawsuit, the Ely family was exhausted, but not broken. What had begun as a cold legal filing by a stranger had evolved into a test of endurance unlike anything they'd faced before. Time, in this fight, didn't heal. It tested, it wore, and it demanded everything. The delays were endless. Court hearings were postponed, rescheduled, or canceled altogether. Paperwork had to be redone. New heirs had to be located and informed. Deschler's lawyers continued their calculated pressure, dragging the process along, filing technical motions, exploiting the law's every crack. This was more than a legal dispute. It was a siege. Some family members lost hope. Others passed away during the process, their names never to see the final ruling. Their shares transferred to children, many of whom were now young adults, thrust into a decades-old legal quagmire they barely understood. But even as the years dragged on, something powerful happened. The Ely family didn't fall apart. They grew stronger. What started as a defensive response evolved into a bold mission. They began educating themselves on property law, digging through centuries of legal discrimination baked into systems designed to fracture families like theirs. Michael and the Land Retention Committee hosted workshops, attended community legal clinics, and consulted with land rights advocates who had seen similar cases in Mississippi, Georgia, and the Carolinas. And as the case crawled through the courts, it started drawing attention. Local reporters picked it up first, then regional outlets. Eventually, land justice organizations and national advocacy groups began to cite Ely vs. Deschler as a case that embodied a quiet crisis in America, the silent bleeding of black land through heirs' property laws. Michael, once just a grandson trying to protect his grandfather's dream, found himself invited to speak on panels, podcasts, even at university forums. Each time, he told a story, not with bitterness, but with fire. "This isn't just about us," he said. "It's about every black family who's ever watched their history slip away through legal loopholes." The growing support reinvigorated the family. Donations trickled in. Pro bono lawyers reached out again, this time from larger firms. The committee restructured the strategy, refined their filings, and prepared for a final push. 12 years had passed. Deschler still wanted the land. But now the Elys had something even stronger than lawyers. They had the country watching. And behind them, the spirits of generations were standing guard. It was a humid morning in August 2023 when Michael Robinson stepped into the courthouse for what he hoped would be the final time. 12 years of legal filings, 12 years of missed reunions, sleepless nights, prayer circles, and committee calls. The land in Barlow Bend had withstood hurricanes, droughts, and plows. But this was the storm of a generation. And after more than a decade, the court was finally ready to rule. Michael sat in the courtroom surrounded by cousins, nieces, nephews, and even a few great-grandchildren of Joe Ely. Some wore Sunday best, others simple T-shirts printed with the words, "This land is our legacy," eyes forward, hearts pounding. The judge's voice was steady, but deliberate. James E. Deschler, the second's petition to force the sale of the 127-acre property, dismissed. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence was its own kind of victory. Some family members wept quietly. Others exhaled like they hadn't in years. Michael simply closed his eyes and whispered, "We kept it, Papa." The judge's ruling went further than anyone expected. Not only was Deschler's legal maneuver struck down, but the court also acknowledged the cultural and ancestral value of the land itself, an almost unheard of recognition in a legal system that typically reduced land to mere dollars and cents. And as for Deschler's 1/15th share, returned. The court ordered it to be transferred back to the Ely family, restoring the unity of the land once more. For the first time in years, the entire property was back in the family's hands. The news spread quickly. Articles called it a landmark decision. Advocates for black land retention hailed it as a blueprint for others fighting similar battles. Even state lawmakers took notice, proposing revisions to Alabama's partition laws to prevent such predatory lawsuits in the future. But for the Elis, the victory wasn't just legal. It was spiritual. Back in Barlow Bend, they gathered again. Old grills were fired up. Kids ran barefoot through the fields. Elders told stories beneath the same trees they had once feared would be sold to strangers. They danced. They prayed. They remembered. But this time, they did it with certainty. They had weathered every storm, legal, emotional, and historical. And now, the land was theirs not just in name, but in permanence. And though Joe Ely wasn't alive to witness the moment, his vision, his quiet, defiant purchase in 1941, had been fulfilled in full. The trees looked taller that fall. The fields stretched wider. The air felt thicker, with something unspoken. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was peace. Or maybe it was the ghosts of the past finally resting, knowing the land was safe. Michael Robinson stood under the same oak tree where his grandfather once tied down tarps before the rain. Only now he wasn't a boy watching from the porch. He was the man who stood in court, who answered motions, who called cousins in the middle of the night asking for signatures, donations, help. He was no longer fighting. The land was no longer at risk. But something new was beginning. The family gathered again, this time not in protest or strategy, but in celebration. Folding chairs were lined across the grass. The grill was smoking. Someone brought a projector to show old family photos against a white bedsheet. Laughter echoed through the woods, louder than it had in years. But beyond the food and the hugs, something serious was happening too. Papers were signed, documents notarized. A new entity formed, Ely Family Legacy, LLC. One by one, the heirs signed over their shares, not to sell, but to protect. The LLC would carry the name, the land, and the vision forward. No more fragmentation, no more court notices, no more surprises. They set up a land stewardship committee, created a fund for future legal protections, and began laying plans for a community garden. One cousin pitched a farm-to-table venture, another proposed an eco-retreat. The ideas flowed not with desperation, but with joy. They had won the right to dream again. Later that evening, the family circled up, hands clasped, eyes closed. A prayer was offered, long, trembling, grateful. And when it ended, Michael looked around at the children, the elders, the photographs of those who didn't live to see this day. His voice broke only once. "We didn't just keep the land," he said. "We kept each other." No applause followed, only silence, the kind that means everything has been said. The sun dipped low over Barlow Bend, and for the first time in 12 years, the land breathed easy.